Last few years, I have led Atlas Network's storytelling work to feature the real people whose lives have been transformed thanks to the advocacy work of our partners. Some of you in between sessions may have seen an example of such storytelling with a short film about e-rickshaws and a quota that they overcame in Biratnagar, Nepal. And over the last few years, we filmed across 4 continents for this project, including last year in and around Kathmandu with the Samriddhi Foundation, and actually just last month in the state of Georgia with the Georgia Center for Opportunity. I'll be joined today by Randy Hicks and Arpita, Nepal of those organizations to examine the central theme of our Dignity Unbound campaign, and that is the local civil society leaders within Atlas Network, our network, are better positioned than anyone else to diagnose what barriers to economic freedom, to opportunity exist around the world, and what needs to change in order to unlock prosperity for the people in those places. Randy Hicks is the president and CEO of the Georgia Center for Opportunity, a group that he's led to be at the forefront of advocating for solutions to create greater economic opportunity for low-income populations here in the United States, and whose group was a finalist for the Templeton Freedom Award in 2017 for their work to make it easier to reintegrate into society for formerly incarcerated people in the state of Georgia. Arpita Nepal is the co-founder and director of research and development at Samriddhi Foundation, which is a longtime partner of Atlas Network. And attendees of last year's Liberty Forum may remember the short film screening we had of the story about the ride-sharing app Toodle and all the work that Samriddhi did to both legitimize that model and to incorporate that business legally. Arpita and Randy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, AJ.
Excellent. The first question will go to Randy. And as I mentioned, GCO has been a leader among think tanks in championing economic opportunities for low-income communities here in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about GCO's history on this and how you approach this important cause?
Yes. Well, at its core, our work at GCO has always been about what might be called the defining American idea, that everyone should have an opportunity to achieve a better life, to achieve their potential, regardless of their race, regardless of their circumstances, regardless of past mistakes. Now, I say that's the defining American idea. The reality is that that's really human aspiration worldwide. It's why people move, switch jobs, switch countries, right? They're looking for something. They're looking for that opportunity to achieve a better life. Well, because that's our focus, and that's really why our principles matter in the first place, we wanted to look at that population and focus on the population that seems to have the greatest number of barriers to achieving their potential, to achieving that better life. And so we began looking at the impoverished communities, kind of trying to unpack what it takes to live a flourishing life. And then once we had that, we decided, let's look at public policies from the perspective of how those are either helping or hurting the ability of impoverished communities or low-income communities to rise. But we don't only do policy work, we also work at the community level, helping community leaders figure out how to remove barriers at the local level. So just as we tell state policy leaders to not wait for the federal government to take action, we also tell people at the community level, don't wait for state leaders to take action. You can do something here in civil society to change lives.
And in working at the community level and taking a very tailored, specific approach, a lot of that involves building trust, building a sense of authenticity with a lot of people we haven't spoken with before. What does that process look like for GCO?
Yeah, well, when we want to understand an issue, one of the first things we do is we go talk to the people on the ground who are actually working on issues. You know, AJ, the reality is if we're going to break the logjam on a lot of these policy issues, we need to engage people at the community level who are focused on results. And that gives us insights we wouldn't otherwise have. We're not just looking for academics with white papers. We're looking for people on the ground who have, holes in their shoes and calluses, right? We want people who actually know what it's like to help people rise above their circumstances. And so we dive in on any issue we're working on to talk to those people who know it best, and even those who are seeking opportunity. And of course, that gives us not just the ability to do work at the local level, it gives us what I call a gritty authenticity at the legislative level. When we go in, we understand these issues probably better than your average think tank.
Mm-hmm. And I think, at least from our conversation last month, part of or how criminal justice reform plays into this is you mentioned going into the community of inner city Atlanta and seeing how many communities or people in the community have been touched by the criminal justice system. Can you talk about the interplay between those two issues?
Yeah, we went in years ago to kind of help leaders in the inner city of Atlanta strengthen families. And one of the things we were told by leaders was you're not going to strengthen families if you don't address the issue of prisoner reentry, because the correction system touches so many lives and shapes their ability to work, their ability to connect with their community. And so it was really working in that community that we became very sensitive to what was going on in criminal justice and led us down the path of becoming champions for policy changes that would lower barriers to work for the formerly incarcerated, because that's the #1 predictor of whether or not somebody's going to re-enter the workforce successfully and reconnect with their community.
And I know you consider a good chunk of your work is to engage at the community level, to be a service-oriented organization, but you've also had some policy reforms over the last few years. Can you tell us a little bit about the success that you've had in Georgia and perhaps any projects that you're trying to take beyond your state and to encourage elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously criminal justice reform has been a big piece of it. Working on reentry, making sure that people re-entering society have IDs and licenses that they don't have. They're not walled off from different professions because of their criminal history, a criminal history that may have nothing to do with the profession they seek to enter. But we've also worked on things like school choice. One of the reasons why we championed over a decade ago a school choice bill to provide greater access and choice for special needs kids, and why we supported a school choice bill that would increase access for the poor to schools, is because we had been in the community, we had seen the problems, we knew the people. And then, of course, we're working on welfare reform right now. One of the things we've talked about at previous Atlas events is the fact that there are people who turn down jobs and turn down job promotions because the welfare system traps them. So we're working on creating a framework for state-level welfare reform that will encourage work, encourage family formation, weed out waste and fraud, and help people find work. But we're doing that also in partnership with think tanks in Texas and Louisiana, so that we take a bit more of a regional approach, learn from each other, source as well.
Excellent. And I believe we'll be speaking more about disrupting the welfare market as well in a next breakout session. And thank you for kicking us off, Randy. Arpita, I want to kick it to you. I know a challenge that we talked about last year in the many interviews that we had is that it's an ever-shifting institutional environment of policymakers within Nepal. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of cascading factors to navigate. So I'm curious, what are the top issues in the country right now, and what are your top priorities for working into the next year of 2021?
Well, the top priorities, like you rightly mentioned, still continue. It is a very, very shifting institutional environment overall, because we're on the process of federalizing. It's a recent democracy. It's a young democracy. Nepal is a young democracy right now. So we're testing up a lot of new ideas. The idea market is open, so that is an optimistic thing. But the challenges continue to be how to institutionalize success stories. So we're still working on that.
Excellent. And can you tell us a little bit about your work to help low-income populations throughout the country and what you've learned in such work?
Sure. So like Randy mentioned, I think one of the priority area of like why we started Samriddhi Foundation was because we wanted, we saw that democracy would only work if democracy delivers, and if democracy delivers for the most vulnerable population. Otherwise, you just end up in a very, very chaotic society, which has identified Nepal's modern history. And so our priority area has always been going to the most vulnerable population, talking to them, asking their issues, and they usually already have a lot of solutions identified. We just needs to be legitimized through legal processes, and that is where our role comes in most importantly. So our most recent work, and in fact the work over the last sort of a decade really, has focused around easing business processes, easing entry requirements, easing exit requirements, specifically targeted to very, very much micro and small enterprises. And in the process, we also try and remove barriers to access to finance. How do you legalize property? So those are some of the things that we've been working on.
Thank you. And one point you mentioned that the communities that you're working with already have the agency. They know what problems are in their way, what needs to be removed for them to just go about living their lives, operating businesses freely. And there are a lot of international voices in the development space that would come in and tell policymakers what needs to change for the country to be successful. So why do you think it's important for Nepal and civil society leaders such as yourself within Nepal to lead your own pathway to prosperity?
Well, that's a very, very important point, especially for a developing economy like Nepal, because wherever there's a power vacuum, there's always a lot of different agents that come into play. And development agencies, especially donor agencies, find a very, very ripe area sort of for intervention. Whenever there is this kind of power vacuum. So because we are an unstable democracy, I think it's very, very important in order to stabilize our own democracy that local people need to take ownership of the ideas and the solutions that are being proposed. And therefore, I think there is a very, very big space for think tank like ours, but not just think tank like ours, but even at a more federal level, at the provincial level, because we're a national level think tank right now. So one of our other work at Samriddhi over at least the last 3 years has been incubating think tanks at the provincial level so that we are actually able to devolve and reach people really at the bottom and give them a certain legitimized agency to a certain extent. So I think that is very important because if you leave it in the power vacuum altogether, then there are a lot of other forces that come up with apparently bright solutions that do not necessarily work.
And I think that's an important point to point out that that same framework of international going and telling or honing in on one country specifically can still be applied from the nation's capital, applied down to the provincial level or the local level. So a lot of people may not be aware that Nepal for the first time is federalizing, forming a federal state. Why did you identify it as an important project to incubate sort of state, we in the United States have state level think tanks as well. Randy's group is one such group. Why is it important to apply that same model to Nepal at this point in time?
Actually, I think a lot of our experience came from the strong network of think tanks that Atlas actually gave us access to. And US is a very good success story because there's such a large amount of established democratic practices. There are established think tanks at the state level that can identify issues at the state level. So I think that was very inspiring for us. So when our country decided to federalize, officially in 2013, one of the first steps we thought about was, well, if we really want to stabilize democracy, if we really want people's voices to be heard at each institutional level, at each level of governance, then we do need representatives or people working at that level. And so that was sort of the inspiration in general.
Thank you. I want to head back to Randy. I want to dive into the project that we were featuring, or that we will soon feature with our next batch of short films, the Hiring Well, Doing Good project or initiative. That program really seems to emphasize local knowledge. Can you tell us a little bit about the program, its formulation, how you were inspired by it, how it's been rolled out, and what the role that local knowledge plays in its success? I believe you may be muted, Randy.
I am sorry about that. So one of the things that we point out always is that ultimately all our public policies are about impacting people locally, right? It's in homes, neighborhoods, and communities that lives are formed. And when things go terribly wrong, it's in homes, neighborhoods, and communities that lives are transformed. So we've always had that focus on community. And when we succeeded in passing the changes in prisoner reentry reform, we immediately thought it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of difference if we pass these laws and nobody knows about them, or the people who actually make hiring decisions don't take the steps to give people an opportunity. So we connected with groups in a couple different areas of our state, in Gwinnett County and in the city of Columbus, started working with businesses and nonprofits to identify the chronically unemployed, the formerly incarcerated, and help remove the barriers that keep them out of the workforce, and then equip them with what they need to enter that workforce. So local knowledge is everything, AJ. I mean, we can't do it if we're not connected to the people who actually make life happen. We don't make life happen at the policy level. Life happens in neighborhoods and communities.
Thank you. And you mentioned as well that a lot of the barriers in people's lives are easily fixable as soon as you just discover what they are. So it could be transportation or affordable childcare. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other soft skills that the underemployed or unemployed people you work with may lack, or easily remove barriers that they face in order to be successful or more successful?
Yeah, there are those kinds of barriers that you just mentioned: transportation, housing, childcare, education, a criminal record. Those are significant. But a lot of times it's just soft skills like knowing how to show up on time, stay engaged, resolve conflict. A lot of people don't have those basic skills. So a lot of the training that the groups we partner with do is address those kinds of soft skills. Businesses will do the job training. They need people to show up who, again, can be there on time, not walk off the job when things start going wrong.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the work I mentioned involves breaking new ground that GCO's had to do, of creating authentic, meaningful relationships. So were there any misconceptions that you faced in engaging businesses or local nonprofits who you haven't worked with before, but who are now enjoy close relationships with you?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about businesses, AJ, you're talking about business leaders that are sometimes much more cautious about hiring somebody, for instance, with a criminal record, believing that there are higher risks associated with it. We had to show them how they're protected, show them what they can do, demonstrate the research that shows how effective and loyal these kinds of employees can be once they're hired and trained. So that's one thing we had to do with the businesses. I think with the nonprofits, the challenge is to get them to be working together and not working just in silos. Everybody can be somewhat self-satisfied and training some people over the course of the year. We want to raise the bar in terms of expectations. And so that's something we work on with our strategic partners at the community level.
Thank you. And looking at the state level or macro level of Georgia, I remember in 2017, the number of Georgians who were under correctional supervision of some form by the state was 1 in 13. And I believe that number is now 1 in 19. So what changed?
That's correct.
What changed in reducing the amount of recidivism or reducing the amount of people who go into the system in general?
Yeah, there were a number of things. We did front-end prison reform, or sentencing reform was a key to that, right? It's just recognizing that we handed out a lot of felonies to people who didn't deserve felonies or misclassified crimes, quite frankly. In addition to that, we were locking up people who were low risk, nonviolent offenders. So that change helped a lot. But as far as recidivism goes, one of the things that's happened is once we lowered those barriers to work that we mentioned, many more people have been able to find work and therefore stay out of prison and be well connected or better connected to their communities.
Thank you. And we'll bounce back to Arpita on the theme of policy being implemented to achieve certain aims, I recall a recent appearance you had where you discussed a tax probate that was introduced to try to encourage greater market access or economic participation on the role of women in Nepali society, of offering tax bonuses or probates, excuse me, to women-owned businesses. What were the results of such a policy, and how was it manipulated, although well-intentioned?
Yes, so there are a lot of these affirmative actions of this kind that come into place in a country like Nepal. And one of the problems with such a policy, a very well-intentioned policy, is the fact that the power of businesses or the ownership of businesses still remain in the male hands. So say, for example, if you give all these, tax probates and so on or tax incentives for women-owned enterprises, all we have is the males of the family registering the enterprise in the name of the female, but the actual power still remains with the male of the family. And so it really is not achieving the ends that you actually want. So we're still struggling with these kind of policy. Sometimes I think not well thought through policy, very well intentioned, but not really well thought through policy consequences.
And in the post-COVID environment, what do you think needs to happen in order to actually create greater market access for women in Nepali society?
So yeah, this is one of the things we've been discussing about, and I think the best response comes from the community level. It is at what we call the administrative, we call it the ward level. It's the smallest community governance level in Nepal. So it's the municipalities, it's the wards. If they have enough fiscal devolution, if they have the power, then they're the ones who can grant, these kind of easing the business environment. The best response so far is as businesses continue to open up in the post-COVID-19 environment, we just need to ease up their processes. We need to ease up regulations. We need to ease up, entry and exit mechanisms. We need to ease up, tax administration. Collateralizing. We need to ease up these processes. Right now, we're just mired in a lot of bureaucracy. So I think if we focus more on easing up these processes, I think that's the best response. Our talk with local level leaders shows that, at the local level, leaders actually recognize this. The problem right now is dealing with this centralized bureaucracy. How do you make a centralized bureaucracy really understand what's happening at the local level, and how do you help them respond in a rapid way?
Thank you. And on the post-COVID environment point, Randy, the Hiring Well, Doing Good program has been tremendously successful in connecting people in need with meaningful work during this challenging time. What do you see as the next frontier for both that program, but GCO's work in general, operating in the post-COVID recovery environment?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, because of the things we work on now, the issues we work on, education, employment, and family stability, those are the three big things that were affected by the quarantine, by the shutdown. So in terms of Hiring Well, Doing Good specifically, our focus changed a little bit. Prior to COVID, we were focused on the chronically unemployed. But once COVID hit, obviously there were thousands upon thousands of Georgians who lost their jobs, but we're on the edge economically, on the edge of economic trouble. So we started working with business leaders and even government officials to help reconnect people, reattach people to work. That work is going to continue. It's bigger and it's more important than ever. We see and hear from leaders across the state who are interested in figuring out, moving forward, how all these people who lost their jobs are going to re-enter the workforce. So that work is going to continue. And we're going to continue to, as I talked about earlier, look for those policy barriers and regulations that really hinder people's progress, that keep them from achieving a better life and from achieving their potential.
I really must implore the audience who is seeking composed majorly of think tank leaders themselves who are seeking to achieve similar local impact or work more locally to really seek out the wise counsel of GCO and Samriddhi Foundation as well. And since Randy touched on it, Arpita, you've talked about the importance of local knowledge, local context, and engaging with the local bureaucracies in identifying, number one, the right problems, but also, two, developing the right solutions at that local level. So what is Samriddhi's vision for the success of its incubator program? Is it a dozen local think tanks throughout Nepal who are all serving their communities well?
Well, right now our target is just 7 across the 7 provinces, at least 1 in each province. And we've been incubating them for the last 3 years. Some more than others, and we've already have had some successes. You've already showed Bikalpa's video, which we are extremely proud of the work that they're doing in Biratnagar that you showed during the breakout session. We've similarly have had successes in 2 other think tanks, one in western part of Nepal and one in the midwestern part of Nepal. Both think tanks are showing a lot of promise. So yeah, I mean, the target is 7 at the point.
Thank you. And I do want to be mindful of time as we're approaching the end of the session. I have a bit of an open-ended question for both of you. As Atlas Network is placing more emphasis on the role of human dignity in our work and within the context of our work, and also Brad Lipps, our CEO, recently mentioned in an interview that empathy could be the future of the freedom movement. So I'm curious, both of you, if any, what role do you see for human dignity and empathy, and what does it mean within the context of your work? And we'll start with Arpita.
For me, human dignity and empathy is actually recognizing the stakeholders, the beneficiaries, the last people, like Randy mentioned, the community, the neighborhood, the family. They're the ones who are actually dealing with day-to-day lives. And so empathy really means policymakers recognizing, putting themselves in their shoes and thinking through policies and actually asking them what works. Because I think some of the brilliant ideas, the local knowledge already exists there, and Hayek has told us like many decades ago. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Listen to Hayek.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've got 5 core values. The first one is dignity, and we've had that for a very long time. The idea there is that every single person is inherently worthy of respect. And there's another component to dignity that is both discoverable and developable, right? It's as people become more of who they can be. Nelson Mandela, there's a great Nelson Mandela quote, "No power on this earth can destroy the thirst for human dignity." And I believe that's absolutely right. And just a little bit of a word on the issue of empathy. I think this is often lost in our public policy debates, and it's where we can actually be much more effective by developing it. A few years ago, I was meeting with leaders. We were talking about what kinds of outcomes we should be seeking for the poor and for the homeless. And one of the leading experts, so to speak, on the issues of poverty and homelessness basically said, "Oh, don't worry about work or anything like that. They don't care about that stuff. They just need to be made comfortable." Well, I think this actually is a kind-hearted person, but she had lost her sense of empathy. She had failed to see these fellow human beings as having similar longings and similar aspirations that we have. So if our movement is going to be effective, I think we've got to have that empathy, remember that these people are a lot like us and they long for something better.
Thank you both. Very powerful message indeed. And as you can tell, Atlas Network is very excited about the great work that both Randy and Arpita's teams are doing around the world. In addition to the many innovative and effective think tanks that we've invested in over the last several years on this campaign. We really believe at Atlas Network that Dignity Unbound is all about the next frontier of the liberty movement internationally. That you can both promote economic freedom and local institutions, and when you promote both at the same time, the solutions are far more powerful than any outsider could ever develop and try to implement on any society. Tune in next month. In December, we'll be screening a special virtual premiere of our next short film in our series featuring the work of Georgia Center for Opportunity. We're very excited about that. And visit dignityunbound.org to learn more about this project. Next up, we will have 3 concurrent breakout sessions, so please return to your agenda page to select which you want to join, and those are Free Enterprise for 51% of Humanity, A Better Way, Disruption in the Welfare Market, that's where I'll be, and Europe Roundtable, Restoring Essential Freedoms in 2021. Thank you for tuning in.